Mike Johnson's voice rises, cold, absolute. The gentlewoman's time has expired. The words hang there, sterile and final. Jasmine Crockett freezes mid-sentence, her lips still forming the truth she wasn't finished speaking. Her hand lifts instinctively, not in defiance but in disbelief. Around her murmurs swell, half outrage, half shock. The silence that follows is not peace. It's pressure. Johnson's glare holds steady. His gavel lowers like a verdict. The gentlewoman is out of order. The phrase hits harder than the wood against the desk. Crockett's mic cuts. The sound dies. The chamber, once loud with debate, now feels like a cathedral after a sermon no one agreed to hear. And yet, in that silence, every heartbeat in the room sinks to the same thought. Did that really just happen? A representative and elected voice of the people just silenced mid-sentence for daring to speak truth to authority. Her expression hardens, not with anger, but with clarity. The lens zooms in on her eyes, unflinching. This is not submission. Its record members shift in their seats. Someone mutters, "Unbelievable." Another whispers, "She was right." The speaker glances toward the clerk, then back toward the floor, as though authority itself could erase what everyone just witnessed. The narrator's voice cuts in, steady and low. They thought a gavel could silence her, but sometimes silence speaks louder than thunder. The chamber lights burn too bright, washing everything in harsh white. Crockett lowers her hand slowly, refusing to look away. The tension becomes cinematic every second, a battle between power and poise. Somewhere a phone camera keeps rolling. Somewhere a headline is already being written. The frame tightens. The sound fades to a low hum, and the screen cuts to black. A single line appears on screen, banned from speaking. The narrator's final whisper slices through the darkness. But what Mike Johnson didn't expect was that silencing one voice would awaken hundreds. For years, Mike Johnson built his name on one word: order. He came to Washington promising to restore it, to make the chamber respectable again, to cleanse the noise and return politics to what he called principle. But principle, in his world, looked a lot like control. To his supporters, he was calm, disciplined, God-fearing. To his critics, he was the smiling face of repression, a man who preached unity but demanded obedience. He rose through the ranks quietly, a Southern lawyer with a preacher's cadence and a judge's patience. He spoke about decorum the way others spoke about democracy, as if one could not survive without the other. He called for civility while building walls around dissent. Each time a voice from the margins grew too loud, he'd find a rule, a clause, a procedural hammer to quiet it. When he took the speaker's chair, he promised a new era of respect on the House floor. Cameras caught him clasping the gavel like a holy relic. His allies nodded in solemn approval. But behind the polished wood and formal tone was something older, something territorial, a belief that authority must never be questioned in public. Enter Jasmine Crockett. A freshman. Representative from Texas with a voice like a clarion and a rhythm born of protest mics and courtroom battles. She didn't come to Washington to be quiet. She came to make noise for those whose names never reached the record. Where Johnson saw chaos, she saw democracy breathing. Where he demanded decorum, she demanded honesty. Every word she spoke carried the cadence of resistance, the drawl of the South, the strength of a woman who had spent her life in rooms designed to exclude her. Her supporters called her fearless. Her critics called her theatrical. But in every exchange, her power wasn't in shouting, it was in showing that she wasn't afraid to be heard. That night on the House floor, when Johnson cut her microphone, the moment wasn't about rules. It was about ego. He saw her persistence not as procedure, but as defiance. And defiance to men like him feels like disorder. The narrator's voice softens, almost pitying. He thought the gavel could govern truth. He thought silence would teach respect. But truth, once cornered, learns to roar. In that chamber, two Americas stared each other down, the one that believes order comes from obedience, and the one that believes order comes from equality. Johnson, eyes fixed on his notes, never saw what was brewing around him. Staffers exchanged uneasy looks. Members shifted, whispers spreading like static. A few shook their heads not at Crockett but at him. The very discipline he prided himself on had begun to crack. Outside, social media caught fire. Clips of the confrontation began circulating before the gavel had even cooled. Commentators called it a power move gone wrong, Hashtags sprouted like wildfire. Leatherspeak trended before midnight. But inside the chamber, the storm was just beginning. The narrator leans in. Because power built on silence is power built on sand. And when one woman refused to bow, the foundation began to shake. The camera pans back to the speaker's chair, the gavel still in his hand, but its authority suddenly heavier. Across the aisle, Jasmine Crockett sits unmoved, her gaze steady, her silence more eloquent than 1,000 speeches. The narrator's final words echo like a warning and a promise. But when Jasmine Crockett refused to stay silent, the room itself began to turn. Long before he held the gavel, Mike Johnson mastered the art of conviction. He wasn't born into political power. He crafted it carefully, methodically, like a sermon rewritten until every word carried moral gravity. In small-town Louisiana, his voice first echoed from pulpits and podiums, not campaign rallies. He learned early that confidence, when wrapped in scripture, could sound like truth. He entered politics not as a warrior, but as a missionary. His creed was order. His gospel was obedience. And his faith, rigid, unwavering, was that morality could be legislated into being if only the right men held the reins. He believed himself one of those men. Behind closed doors, his advisors spoke of message discipline. Every appearance, every interview, every quote was measured. He knew the power of optics. To the cameras, he was calm, deliberate, never raising his voice, never revealing irritation. His restraint became his brand. "He doesn't shout," a colleague once said. He controls. But control, once learned, becomes a hunger. And in Johnson, it became doctrine. In private strategy meetings, he spoke in metaphors of purity and corruption. He warned his team about moral decay, about the chaos of undisciplined voices. He viewed dissent not as democracy's pulse, but as disorder to be subdued. His political opponents were not simply wrong, they were wayward souls in need of correction. He often quoted scripture when cornered by tough questions, turning complexity into absolutes. Reporters called him the preacher-politician. And he leaned into it, eyes softened by faith, voice dipped in concern. It was a performance polished by repetition, the steady cadence of a man who believes that the appearance of virtue is virtue enough. The narrator lowers his tone, dry with irony. To defend morality, he silenced a woman. The moment on the House floor wasn't his first attempt to assert control, it was simply his most public. There had been smaller incidents. A committee member cut short for improper tone. A journalist dismissed mid-question for bias. Each act built his fortress higher walls of etiquette reinforced with fear of reprisal. And yet, inside that fortress, there was always the faint hum of insecurity. Those who knew him well noticed it in the pauses, the way his jaw tightened when challenged, the flicker behind his eyes when a statement didn't land clean. The righteousness he projected was armor, and armor always hides a wound. Johnson's moral rigidity wasn't strength, it was defense. Against uncertainty, against complexity, against the idea that truth might not belong to him. The narrator continues, voice sharpening like a knife sliding from its sheath. He preached about respect, yet mistook submission for civility. He demanded silence and called it peace. He believed leadership meant never being questioned. But power that cannot endure questions is not leadership, it is fear in a suit. In televised addresses, Johnson stood behind marble podiums, hands folded like a man at prayer. Cameras caught the faint smile, the calculated stillness. He spoke of values and virtue, but his eyes betrayed vigilance, watching, measuring, waiting for the next spark of defiance to extinguish. He believed history favored the disciplined. He believed authority must be absolute or it would unravel. And when Jasmine Crockett refused to yield, something primal cracked beneath that calm exterior. The gavel became a weapon not of law, but of pride. To the world, it looked procedural, but to him it was existential. Her persistence didn't just disrupt the order of the chamber, it challenged the mythology of his control. The narrator's tone shifts, half reflective, half damning. Mike Johnson built a moral fortress so tall he could no longer see the people he claimed to serve. He thought righteousness was power, when righteousness without humility is only vanity in disguise. In the days that followed, his allies defended him. He was maintaining decorum, they said. He followed the rules. But beneath those defenses lay a quieter truth. He needed the rules not to protect democracy, but to protect himself from it. And so, when he silenced Jasmine Crockett, he believed he was restoring order. Instead, he revealed the fragility of his own authority. The fortress he'd built began to tremble not from attack, but from the echo of his own gavel striking against conscience. In the stillness after the chaos, his face remained calm, his tone composed. Yet the cameras caught the faintest crack, a single exhale, a tightening of the hand around the gavel. Control for the first time felt heavy. The narrator pauses, letting the irony hang. He who sought to teach discipline would soon learn rebellion has its own kind of order. And as the chamber settled, one voice, quiet but unbroken, waited across the aisle, preparing to turn that fortress into rubble. The narrator leans in, voice hushed, almost reverent, but across the aisle, one voice was preparing a response that would echo far beyond the chamber walls. Before the marble floors, before the microphones, before the cameras that now broadcast her every syllable, there was Jasmine, a young attorney standing in a Texas courtroom that never expected to hear a voice like hers. The judge barely looked up when she entered. The opposing counsel smirked. And yet when she began to speak, the room changed temperature. Her tone steady, deliberate, unflinching, cut through the smug laughter of power. It wasn't volume that commanded attention. It was truth that refused to bend. That was where her voice was born, not in privilege, but in resistance. She grew up in a state that loved to talk about justice but rarely practiced it for everyone. She saw neighbors arrested for minor offenses while corporations walked free. She saw young black men thrown into the system for the same things their white counterparts brushed off with warnings. And she decided early, she would not just study the law. She would fight it, shape it, bend it, make it answer for its own hypocrisy. As a public defender, she learned the rhythms of injustice, the way the system sighed before sentencing, the way juries looked everywhere but at her clients. In the back rooms of courthouses, she learned that respectability was often just code for silence. But Jasmine Crockett never learned silence. She learned precision. She learned courage. She learned that the only way to make power listen was to speak so clearly that even denial had to pause. The narrator's voice slows, almost tender. Her voice wasn't made for the marble halls of Congress. It was forged in fluorescent courtrooms, in sweat and cross-examination, in the stories of those who had none. From Dallas protests to voter registration drives, she became a familiar figure, bullhorn in one hand, law degree in the other. Her speeches weren't rehearsed. They were reactions, raw, urgent, necessary. People listened not because she was famous, but because she felt like family. In one rally, when asked what made her keep going, she answered without hesitation, "Because if I don't speak, they'll pretend we agree with their silence." That line would go viral years later, quoted on signs, turned into hashtags, echoing across college campuses and community centers. But back then, it was just truth said out loud by a woman too tired to care about optics. The narrator continues. She didn't wait for permission to lead. She led because she refused to be erased. When she won her congressional seat, pundits called her outspoken, fiery, unapologetic. But those words meant to flatten her only proved how little they understood. She wasn't performing passion. She was performing survival. Every speech was an act of endurance, every question a quiet rebellion against centuries of being told to sit down. And so, when Jasmine Crockett walked into the House chamber for the first time, she brought with her more than credentials, she brought history. Generations of women who had spoken only to be ignored. Communities that had waited for a representative who would not water down their rage. Her colleagues soon learned that behind her quick wit and bold tone was a strategist's mind. She didn't speak recklessly, she spoke intentionally, weaving logic and heart into arguments that landed like thunderclaps. When others used euphemisms, she used names. When others softened for diplomacy, she sharpened for clarity. Clips of her floor speeches began to trend online, not because of theatrics, but because of resonance. One moment in particular, during a heated committee hearing, sealed her reputation. A colleague interrupted her mid-sentence. Dismissing her as emotional, she smiled, paused, then said calmly, "Emotion is what you feel when injustice stops being theory and starts being real." The room fell silent. The internet didn't. The narrator smiles through the words. Her truth was contagious. It reminded people what democracy sounds like when it's alive. Every appearance, every hearing, Every viral clip built not just her profile, but her purpose. She didn't crave fame. She craved fairness. And every time she spoke, the people who had been told they were too loud, too angry, or too much, found themselves reflected in her poise. But that kind of authenticity threatens power, because authenticity cannot be managed. It cannot be muted. When she took the floor the night Mike Johnson silenced her, she wasn't just another representative challenging procedure. She was every woman who'd been talked over, every activist told to calm down, every citizen told to wait their turn. Her voice carried the collective ache of generations and the discipline of a lawyer who knew exactly how far the rules could stretch before they broke. In the split second, before the speaker's gavel fell, she saw it happening. The pattern she'd seen her whole life replaying again in real time. The look of authority dressed as civility. The performance of order used to quiet discomfort. But she also saw the cameras, the witnesses, the world that was no longer willing to look away. The narrator's tone deepens, each word deliberate. She had spent her life fighting for the right to be heard. So when they cut her mic, they didn't silence her, they amplified her. That night wasn't just another congressional spat. It was symbolic, the system trying to discipline its conscience. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't the kind of woman who bowed to ritual. She understood that when power tries to quiet truth, it only proves the truth's necessity. She didn't flinch. She didn't shout. She simply looked up, every inch of her defiance wrapped in dignity, and waited. Because sometimes, the most revolutionary act is refusing to disappear. The narrator's final words for this section linger, soft yet electric. And so, when the speaker tried to silence her, he didn't just stop a speech. He triggered a movement. The chamber was restless even before she spoke. Papers shuffled, aides whispered, and tension hummed like electricity under fluorescent lights. Jasmine Crockett adjusted her microphone, eyes fixed on the speaker's chair. The topic was routine oversight, accountability, transparency, but everyone in that room knew this was no ordinary hearing. Something in the air warned them. This was the kind of night when decorum burns. She began calmly. Mr. Speaker, the American people deserve clarity. They deserve to know why we keep rewriting the rules instead of following them. Her voice carried the even tone of a lawyer cross-examining the system itself, every sentence sharpened with purpose. We cannot claim to stand for truth while silencing the people who speak it. Across the dais, Mike Johnson shifted in his seat. His fingers tapped the gavel once, not enough to interrupt, just enough to remind her that he could. His expression was polite, but his jaw flexed with each word she spoke. "Gentlewoman," he said finally, "please confine your remarks to the resolution at hand." Crockett didn't blink. "I am, Mr. Speaker. The resolution is about accountability, and that's exactly what I'm addressing." A ripple of murmurs ran through the chamber. The speaker's allies leaned back, smirking. His critics leaned forward, listening. Crockett continued, her words now moving faster, fueled by conviction. "If decorum means obedience, then maybe it's time we redefine decorum. Because what's happening here isn't order, it's control." Gasps flickered through the gallery. Someone muttered, "She went there." Johnson gripped the gavel. "The gentlewoman will suspend." But she didn't. She leaned closer to the mic, voice unwavering. "Suspend what, Mr. Speaker? The truth? The right to be heard? Because if that's what this chamber stands for, then maybe the problem isn't my tone, it's your tolerance." Silence fell like a dropped curtain. Every camera turned toward the speaker. His jaw tightened. The gavel struck once, echoing through the hall. "The gentlewoman is out of order." Her eyes met his, steady, unreadable. "Out of order," she repeated softly, as if testing the phrase. "That's what they always call us when we stop playing by their script." The narrator's voice slips in, low and cinematic. It wasn't just a debate anymore. It was a collision between the right to speak and the hunger to silence, between a system built to contain and a woman built to confront. Johnson straightened, his composure now strained. "This is the people's house," he said, voice taut. "We must maintain respect." "And this is the people's microphone," she replied. "So maybe the people should hear what's really happening here." Her words hung there, heavy, dangerous. The tension became tangible like the air before a storm. One side of the room watched in awe, the other in alarm. This wasn't just about procedure anymore. It was about permission, who gets it and who decides. The narrator continues. In that instant, the chamber became America in miniature. One voice insisting on order, the other insisting on justice. Both claiming to protect democracy, yet only one willing to risk it. Johnson's gavel struck again. The gentlewoman's time has expired. She didn't flinch. So has patience, Mr. Speaker. The words landed like a slap wrapped in silk. Laughter broke somewhere in the back, nervous, disbelieving. Johnson's face hardened. The room was now divided between those who wanted her to stop and those silently begging her not to. The narrator draws breath. He mistook her persistence for rebellion. Not realizing rebellion was the point. The speaker raised his gavel again. Order, he demanded. Order in the chamber. But the chamber no longer belonged to him. Jasmine Crockett had claimed it with something far stronger than procedure. Presence. The moment stretched a single heartbeat where everything could still be undone. Cameras zoomed in. Viewers watching at home leaned forward. The narrator whispers, words tight with suspense. Every revolution begins with someone refusing to yield. And on that night, Jasmine Crockett became the refusal. Her voice cut through one last time, calm, defiant, final. You can't govern silence, Mr. Speaker. You can only prove it. And then the narrator's tone drops. Breath almost held. Then came the moment that no one could take back the order to silence her microphone. For a heartbeat, there was nothing. Just the faint hum of the air conditioning and the heavy silence of a chamber that didn't know what it had just witnessed. Jasmine Crockett's microphone had gone dead. The speaker's gavel hovered in midair, as if even it hesitated to fall again. Then somewhere in the back rows, a voice broke the silence. Let her speak. It wasn't planned. It wasn't political. It was instinct, one member's gut reaction to seeing justice cut mid-sentence. Heads turned. Cameras pivoted. Johnson's eyes flashed toward the disturbance, but it was too late. The words had spread. Let her speak. Let her speak. A chant started soft at first, then rising, layered with disbelief and defiance. Staffers looked panicked. The speaker struck the gavel again. Bang, bang. Order! Order in the chamber! He shouted. But his voice was already being swallowed by the rising tide of noise. The narrator's voice glides over the chaos. Control doesn't collapse all at once. It unravels thread by thread until the man who once commanded silence finds himself shouting into it. Crockett stood motionless, her hands folded on the podium. The camera zoomed in on her face, calm, composed, almost eerily still. While the room erupted, she didn't flinch. She let the storm rage around her, and in that stillness, she became its center. A reporter's tweet flashed across the screen. Speaker cuts mic on Rep. Jasmine Crockett. Chamber in uproar. Let her speak. Chants erupt. Another tweet followed seconds later. The room is chaos. Johnson looks rattled. Crockett stands silent. The speaker pounded again. The sound echoed but carried no authority. He shouted, "The chamber will come to order!" The narrator leaned in, voice low, deliberate. But you cannot demand order from conscience. You cannot gavel down a reckoning. Across the aisle, another member rose, a veteran congresswoman, gray-haired and weary from decades of decorum. She spoke without mic, her voice carrying over the din. She has the floor, she declared. You will not silence her, the crowd gasped. The speaker's gavel froze mid-strike. Even his allies hesitated. The camera panned to Crockett, still unmoving, still silent. Then slowly she leaned toward the dead microphone, lips parting as if speaking to the air itself. You can cut the mic, she said softly, but not the truth. The chamber fell still, not out of obedience, but awe. The sentence hung there, untouched by power, too simple to refute. Reporters scrambled to transcribe it. Someone whispered, "Did she just say that?" Another murmured, "She did." The narrator's tone swelled with reverence. In a single breath, she turned humiliation into history. What was meant to be silence became scripture. The speaker sat back, his authority visibly shaken. He could still gavel her out, still cite her for disorder, but now, every eye in the room was on him, every camera watching for his next move. The optics had shifted. The hunter had become the hunted. Crockett didn't press the moment. She didn't raise her voice or demand the mic be restored. She simply stood there, dignified, letting the silence speak for her. Around her, murmurs rose like wind building before a storm. A young representative whispered to a colleague, "She just won this moment." The reply came quick, No, she just changed it. The narrator continues, each word pulsing with intensity. The chamber was no longer a battleground, it was a mirror. And in that mirror, America saw itself divided, those who still believed in power, and those who now believed in her. Reporters filed updates in real time. Crockett's calm after being silenced is extraordinary. Speaker Johnson visibly shaken as chamber demands she be heard. This is no longer politics. This is symbolism. Outside, the world began to wake up to the moment. Clips hit social media within minutes. A split screen filled with captions. The speaker who silenced her on one side, the woman who wouldn't bow on the other. Hashtags multiplied. News anchors interrupted broadcasts, but inside it was still just them, the speaker, the representative, and the widening gap between authority and respect. Johnson tried once more, voice strained. The chair reminds all members decorum must be maintained. Crockett tilted her head slightly, that half-smile returning the one that always preceded a truth too sharp to ignore. Then perhaps, Mr. Speaker, the chair should remember who this chamber belongs to. A low rumble rolled through the floor. Laughter, applause, disbelief. The gavel struck again, desperate. Order! But there was no order left. Only revelation. The narrator's tone turns almost cinematic. Every institution believes it can manage rebellion until rebellion starts sounding like reason. More members rose. Some banged their desks in support. Others crossed their arms, scowling, realizing the narrative was slipping away. What had begun as a procedural reprimand was now a symbol of defiance, one that would replay endlessly on every screen in America. The speaker looked small behind his podium. He could enforce the rule, but not the respect. His hand trembled slightly as he adjusted the gavel. He'd won the moment procedurally and lost it historically. Crockett finally stepped back, exhaling. Her allies surrounded her, whispering words of encouragement. The speaker's staff whispered too, but their words carried panic. This looks bad, one muttered. It's everywhere already. The narrator lowers his voice, steady as a heartbeat. She didn't need a microphone anymore. The room had become her amplifier. The silence, her stage, the country, her audience. As the gavel fell one last time, a single flash from the cameras lit her face calm, resolute, victorious. The contrast was unmistakable. One man clinging to control, one woman embodying freedom. Within minutes, the clip was everywhere. News alerts buzzed on phones. Headlines multiplied. Speaker silences representative, but her words echo louder than ever. Crockett's calm defiance ignites firestorm. The narrator's voice crescendos, weaving emotion with inevitability. In that instant, something shifted. Not just in that room, but in every home watching. It was no longer about one representative or one speaker. It was about every time truth was told to sit down and refused. The camera pans from Crockett's face to the speaker's emptying row of supporters. The chant starts again quiet, uncertain at first, then stronger. Let her speak. The narrator's tone softens to a close. Some moments belong to history before they even end. This was one of them. As the screen fades, the sound of clicking keyboards blends with echoing footsteps leaving the chamber. The narrator's final words of the act cut through the hum. By nightfall, the story had escaped the chamber and the nation was watching. The clip hit the internet like a spark in dry grass. Within minutes, it spread across every platform, shared, reshared, dissected, and remixed until it became more than a video. It became a statement, a symbol, a mirror. The first wave was disbelief. Headlines scrolled across screens. Speaker silences Congresswoman mid-speech. Mic cut. Movement born. Jasmine Crockett's calm defiance stuns the House. Then came the hashtags. Leatherspeak. Crockett rises. House revolt. They multiplied like wildfire, each one a rallying cry. A digital fist raised in solidarity. The narrator's voice threads through the chaos, steady and observant. In an era where attention is the new currency, her silence became priceless. What was meant to be erased turned into the sound every American was suddenly hearing. Clips looped on TikTok and X. A teenager in Chicago recorded herself watching the footage, tears glinting in her eyes. She said what we've all been trying to say, she whispered. Another young woman in Atlanta stitched the video, her voice shaking with pride. That's what strength looks like. That's what grace under fire is. Crockett's face flooded timelines, still unflinching, dignified. Commentators called it the image that broke the gavel. Cable news anchors couldn't get enough. Conservative pundits claimed Johnson had simply enforced rules. Liberal analysts countered that he had exposed the fragility of power. The debate lit up every panel, every late-night monologue. One host leaned forward and said, "What we saw last night wasn't disorder. It was democracy breathing again." The narrator punctuates the noise with a whisper. Across the country, millions watched a man wield authority and a woman wield courage. Only one of them came out stronger. Politicians weighed in fast. One senator tweeted, "If truth makes you uncomfortable, maybe it's not the speaker who's out of order." Another defended Johnson. Rules exist for a reason. But even those trying to minimize it couldn't stop the avalanche. Within hours, the clip had been viewed over 20 million times. A poll appeared on social media asking, "Who really represented the people last night?" The results weren't close. Meanwhile, late-night hosts turned the event into satire, splicing the footage of Johnson's gavel with laugh tracks, captions flashing, "When you mute the truth but forget it's trending." The audience roared, but amid the humor was reverence. In classrooms, teachers played the clip during civics discussions. Activists shared it as proof that resistance doesn't always roar, it can stand tall and wait. In Dallas, a muralist began sketching her next piece. Jasmine Crockett, standing before a wall of microphones, eyes forward, calm amid the storm. The artist captioned it, "Unmuted." The narrator's voice slows, taking in the shift. She had become more than a person. She was now a symbol, a reminder that dignity, once witnessed, cannot be unsaid. Across cable networks, the story evolved from outrage to reflection. Commentators replayed the moment frame by frame, the speaker's gavel, the flicker in Crockett's eyes, the single breath before she spoke her immortal line, "You can cut the mic, but not the truth." That phrase spread faster than the footage itself. It appeared on shirts, on protest signs, in bios and banners. Late-night hosts quoted it. Politicians repeated it. Activists chanted it. In Philadelphia, a college student led a small rally outside City Hall, holding up a cardboard sign that read, "You can cut the mic, but not the truth." The crowd repeated it like scripture, every echo louder than the last. Meanwhile, inside the Capitol, staffers whispered about the Crockett effect. The Speaker's office went into damage control, releasing statements about maintaining procedural integrity, but it was too late. The narrative had escaped their grasp. The narrator's tone grows wry. They tried to contain it with press releases. But you can't contain momentum. You can't reframe a movement that's already found its rhythm. Cable networks showed split screens, one side, Crockett standing tall, the other Johnson looking stern, defensive. Analysts pointed out how symbolism had overtaken politics. One veteran journalist said, "This is what happens when the gavel meets the age of virality." And in that swirl of punditry and politics, something more intimate was happening. Parents told their daughters, "That's what bravery looks like." Activists whispered, "That's our voice." And in homes across America, people who had long stopped believing anyone inside Washington could speak for them felt a flicker of hope. The narrator, now soft again, "In every generation there comes a moment when power overreaches and in doing so, awakens the very thing it tried to suppress." This was that moment. By evening, the soundbite had reached beyond politics. Pop stars tweeted it. Professors quoted it. Pastors preached it. Talk show audiences applauded just hearing her name. Jasmine Crockett wasn't trending. She was resonating. Even those who disagreed with her politics found something undeniable in her composure. A conservative columnist wrote, "You may not agree with her tone or her politics, but there was something sacred about the calm with which she faced authority." The narrator gives the line space to breathe. She didn't shout down power. She made it shrink itself. And as night fell over the Capitol dome, the story took its final turn. Networks replayed the footage under swelling music, her image framed by headlines about courage and conscience. The narrator concludes this chapter with the weight of inevitability. They wanted her silent. Instead, they gave her the loudest mic in America, a long pause, then one final note, the soft flicker before the next storm. But as the noise grew louder, Jasmine's next move would redefine what it means to speak power to power. Morning sunlight poured through the Capitol windows like a quiet reckoning. The uproar had settled into something heavier reflection. News vans still lined the streets outside, microphones waiting, but inside, Jasmine Crockett walked the hallways with the calm of someone who had already said everything she needed to say. She didn't return fire. She didn't gloat. She didn't post a victory tweet. She let the truth breathe. When reporters finally reached her, their questions came in waves. How do you feel? What happens next? Do you plan to confront the speaker? She paused, then spoke softly, every syllable deliberate. They tried to mute me, she said, but this is the people's mic. And as long as I'm standing here, I'll keep speaking for them. That line, simple and steady, rippled outward again, airwaves, timelines, talk shows, headlines. But now the tone was different. The chaos had become clarity. The outrage had become meaning. The narrator's voice enters like a hymn. She didn't answer humiliation with hostility. She answered it with humanity. She didn't fight for herself. She fought for the principle that every voice, no matter how inconvenient, belongs in the American chorus. Clips replayed her composure. Commentators analyzed her restraint. This, one said on air, is what moral authority looks like in real time. And she hadn't even raised her voice. Crockett later took to the floor again, not for confrontation, but for closure. She spoke of democracy, of the obligation to defend it even when it offends power. Our voices, she said, aren't granted by procedure. They're guaranteed by the people. If we forget that, we forget what this place stands for. Members who had stayed silent before now nodded. Some even stood. There was no applause, just respect, deep and unspoken. The narrator's tone softens. She reminded them that democracy is not decorum. It's courage in public. It's the audacity to speak even when the room isn't ready to listen. Across the country, her words became part of a larger conversation about who gets heard and who gets handled. Churches quoted her in sermons. Teachers used her speech in civics lessons. Activists printed it on banners. Her moment had transcended the walls that tried to contain it. In one small town in Mississippi, a young girl raised her hand in class and said, "She talks like my mom." In Los Angeles, a college student wrote an op-ed titled, "The Mic Belongs to Us Now." In Washington, even those who once dismissed her began to acknowledge that something had shifted. The narrator builds the emotion with gentle cadence. She had turned a procedural humiliation into a democratic parable. Power had tried to silence dignity, and in doing so, reminded the nation why dignity matters. Crockett didn't claim victory. She called it a lesson. "If my silence taught them anything," she said later, "I hope it's that respect can't be demanded, it has to be earned." It was a warning wrapped in grace, a reminder that civility without justice is just control wearing perfume. For once, even the speaker's allies grew quiet. Johnson's office released a brief statement about moving forward in unity, but the words rang hollow. The narrative had outgrown him. What was once about procedure had become about principle, and he no longer held the pen. The narrator pauses, letting the truth settle. In politics, speeches fade. But moments like this, when truth stands tall and silence, become architecture. They remind us what kind of nation we still aspire to be. As the sun set over the Capitol dome, Crockett stood on the steps, surrounded by supporters. A journalist asked her what she hoped people took from all this. She smiled a small, knowing smile that carried more conviction than any speech could. That no one can own the mic, she said. Not in this country. It belongs to the people. Always has. The narrator rises into crescendo. She didn't win because she shouted the loudest. She won because she remembered who she was speaking for. And that more than power, more than politics, is what makes a voice immortal. A slow fade to black. Text appears on screen. Dignity always wins. Then a whisper, part echo, part prophecy. And yet, this may only be the beginning. Because silence has a way of echoing. The screen fades from the Capitol to faces ordinary people, lit by phone screens, watching the moment that shook the chamber. The narrator's voice returns, calm but resolute, carrying the weight of everything we've seen. In a world that rewards silence, dignity is the loudest rebellion. Clips flash, the gavel, the chants, Jasmine Crockett standing tall in stillness. Her voice echoes faintly, "You can cut the mic, but not the truth." The narrator continues, "She didn't just defend her right to speak, she defended ours." against arrogance, against control, against the quiet erasure that so often passes for order. The music swells, strings and drums rising together. Images shift from the house chamber to streets, classrooms, living rooms, people everywhere reclaiming their voices. Dignity versus domination, courage versus control. Every generation must decide which side of that line it stands on. The sound softens, the words slowing, almost whispered. They silenced one woman for a moment. But they awakened a movement that refuses to be quiet. The screen turns black except for a single line of white text. Be the voice. Then the narrator delivers the closing line steady, reverent, final, in a chamber built for voices. One voice reminded us all, silence is never neutral, a pause. Then the call to action appears on screen, bold and bright. If her courage inspired you, share this story. Comment. Let her speak. If you believe in truth over titles. Music crescendos, hopeful, cinematic. The final image fades into the glow of the Capitol dome at night. Lights still burning, as if the story isn't over. The narrator's last whisper lingers. The mic is yours now. Use it.